Now teaching at the London School of Economics, Hayek feared that Keynes' Brave New World was a big step in the wrong direction. He attacked the growing consensus by writing The Road to Serfdom. Sarcastically dedicated to socialists of all parties, it was a popular success. There was even a cartoon version of it. Its message was simple and direct. Too much government planning means too much government power. And too much government power over the economy destroys freedom and makes men slaves. For Hayek, central planning was the first step to a totalitarian state.
Well, Hayek thought that since freedom was an absolute, you must let a competitive system just work itself out. And if at times that meant there was considerable unemployment, well, that's what you had to put up with.
Hayek always rejected macroeconomics. He rejected any government intervention during the Great Depression itself. Whereas Keynes was an activist, said in the long run we're all dead. And in the long run, if we allow things to go on without remedy, we get lots of Hitlers, lots of wars, lots of Stalins. Now, who was right?
Most people would have agreed with Keynes when he wrote this to Hayek.
What we want is not no planning, or even less planning. We almost certainly want more.
In the battle of ideas, Hayek was on the losing side.
I had a fairly good reputation as an economic theorist in 1944 when I published The Road to Serfdom. And it was treated, even by the academic community, very largely as a malicious effort by a reactionary to destroy high ideals.
With the world at war, Keynes traveled to Bretton Woods and a Grand Resort hotel. Here, delegates gathered from all over the world to organize the post-war economy. The Bretton Woods Conference created the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. They were designed to bring stability to the world economy and prevent the unemployment and the depression of the 1930s. Keynes' idealism and humanity were an inspiration.
There has never been such a far-reaching proposal on so great a scale to provide employment in the present and increase productivity in the future. And I doubt if the world yet understands how big a thing we are bringing to birth.
Keynes did not have long to live. Ill and overworked, his health gave way, but his reputation and influence outlived him.
When Keynes died, Keynes and I were the best-known economists. Then two things happened. Keynes died and was raised to sainthood, and I discredited myself for publishing The Road to Serfdom. And that changed the situation completely. And for the following 30 years, it was only Keynes who counted, and I was gradually almost forgotten.
The war was over, and the troops came marching home. The final summit conference of the three wartime allies took place in a palace in the Berlin suburb of Potsdam. Truman, Churchill, and Stalin came to plan the peace and to redraw the map of Europe. Their different economic systems offered alternative paths to prosperity, but the Great Depression continued to cast its long shadow.
There's no doubt that at the end of World War II, there was a tremendous loss of faith in the market economy. You had a feeling in large parts of the world, we don't want to go that way. We want to go a better way.
In Britain, the troops were coming home to a general election.
Well, I came back in a troop ship in the summer of 1945. I was a pilot in the Royal Air Force, and I was picked as a 19-year-old to be the Labour candidate. All these soldiers all said, never again, we're never going back to unemployment, Great Depression, to fascism, to rearmament. We want to build a new society.
During the dark war years, Britain had been governed by a coalition of conservatives and socialists. Winston Churchill, the great wartime leader and head of the Conservative Party, expected an easy victory. Everywhere he went, huge crowds turned out to cheer the nation's hero. Heading the campaign against Churchill was Clement Attlee, leader of the Labour Party. Attlee argued that Britain had planned the war, and now planning would win the peace.
We knew that our people would never have stood the bombardments and the loss of life and the hardship if they hadn't been confident that their government was operating a policy of fair shares. We set out to ensure this system of fair shares and of planning and controls continued after the war.
Churchill, who was influenced by Hayek's book, The Road to Serfdom, opposed planning and controls.
No socialist system can be established without a political police, some form of Gestapo.
He got carried away with this Gestapo. And this, of course, it was carrying things to absurdity. Gestapo in Britain.
Attlee, a mild-mannered Christian socialist, gave Churchill's gaffe a sinister spin.
Attlee actually went out of his way to refer to this foreign professor with this Friedrich August von Hayek, this foreign chap with a slightly German accent.
Britain went to the polls. The result was sensational.
Here is the state parties up to 3 o'clock in detail. Conservatives, 180. Labour, 364.
Churchill was out. The people had voted for a new socialist Britain.
The Labour Party swept apart simply because the vast majority of people, particularly those men and women in the fighting forces who'd lived through the dreadful depression years of the 30s, just said, Churchill's done a fine job of war leader, but we don't trust him to win the peace.
What kind of society do you want?
Attlee promised his party that they would build a new Jerusalem.
Let's go forward into this fight in the spirit of William Blake. I will not cease from mental fight, nor shall the sword sleep in my hand, till we have built Jerusalem in England's green and pleasant land.
William Blake's hymn, Jerusalem, became an anthem for the labor movement.
You know, it seemed to people who'd been through a war, it seemed to them natural justice. Why not pool your resources? And so we broke into the concept of the sacredness of private property.
When labor took power, private owners were compelled to sell their businesses. labor created a mixed economy in which newly nationalized industries coexisted with private enterprise. Now, government-owned industries like coal, rail, and steel no longer enriched owners and shareholders, but worked for the common good.
So it was an act of regeneration, of renewal. That was the hope. And it was a hope that gave us the welfare state, gave us the National Health Service, gave us full employment, gave us trade union rights, really rebuilt the country from the bottom up.
The welfare state provided care, free of charge, from womb to tomb. Nobody, rich or poor, would need to fear poverty, ignorance, unemployment, ill health, or old age.
And people said this is better than allowing a lot of gamblers to run the world where they're not interested in us, but only in profit.
Russia ended the war as a military and industrial giant. With the Red Army and the secret police, Stalin imposed his economic system on half of Europe.
The planned economy of Lenin and Stalin had defeated fascism. Scientific socialism seemed to be in the ascendancy.
Socialism was on the march. Capitalism and free markets were on the retreat.
So about 1/3 of the world adopted socialism, sometimes through internal revolution, sometimes through brutal imposition by the Red Army.
The world was divided. The Cold War had begun.